How receptive was the French army hierarchy and their fellow soldiers to diagnoses of mental illness as opposed to simple cowardice?
They were not receptive at all, and some of the French doctors also were closer to the hierarchy than to the soldiers. The hierarchy was quite worried that there would be a huge influx of shakers or psychological casualties. There were many statistics that were done, and the statistics were often contradictory. One reason the statistics was contradictory is that diagnosis was not at the time what it is today. Today, diagnosis of PTSD is defined by the DSM or the book of the American Psychiatric Association. So if you say schizophrenia, if you say PTSD, it's defined, and most doctors will have the same idea about what it means, and you can do statistics. At the time, each doctor had his own diagnosis. One said battle hypnosis or hysteria or pitheatism or whatever. But even if two doctors said hysteria, they didn't have the same definition of the word. And so that's why it was almost impossible to have a valid statistics. And today, when we have a look at the archives and have a look at the statistics from the time, often we do an anachronistic error. Is that we interpret those statistics with today's context, with today's diagnosis, and so that's why the statistics varied from a huge influx of psychological casualties to a very low number, and it also depended on what's the hospital or what's the techniques or affiliation of those doctors had. If you're a neurologist, you diagnose many diagnoses from your field, and you could treat them. If usually you diagnose what will bring you a constituency, what will bring you many patients, and what will diagnoses that you can treat and show that you are a good doctor. So there are many flaws in those statistics.
Yeah, and one of the things to remember is that psychiatry and the psychological profession were relatively new. And so just as you had a military reluctance to have this problem acknowledged, you had a very keen group of people in this new discipline who were very keen to establish their discipline. And you see in Britain conflict between cardiologists and cardiac surgeons who are trying. There's a condition called soldier's heart, which was one of the American Civil War names, which was where soldiers got palpitations. And on one side, you had the new field of psychiatry saying, well, this is a mental problem, we'll deal with it. And you had the cardiacs on the other side saying, no, this is a flaw in the heart, we'll deal with it. So in addition to the differences between the military and the medical spheres, you had differences within institutionally and professionally within the medical profession itself.
This one just at the front there.
Yes. You tell me, how easy was it for the stretcher bearers to deal with gas attacks, and what were the casualty rates of people who were gassed?
Gas is really very inefficient. It's about we think it was about 3 to 5% throughout the war. The main thing about gas is that it was a real pain. It caused them problem with their vision and problem with their breathing. So it was difficult for them to go about the heavy work of lifting patients. And it also created very large numbers of patients. So you could suddenly have 200 patients that needed clearing. One of the skills they had to learn was to try and get those patients. We know a very famous iconic image in Britain is John Singer Sargent's painting Gassed, which is 30 or 40 soldiers who've been gassed with bandages over their eyes, walking in a line with a hand on the shoulder. It was bearers who taught them how to do that because it was simply too difficult for them to carry those patients and for them to lead a large group of walking wounded, gassed wounded. In fact, the chances are they would probably spend a couple of weeks in a field field hospital at the front line. Their eyes would be cleaned, they would be given oxygen therapy to treat the respiratory problems, and then they would go back. So gas wasn't a difficult problem in terms of blighty casualties, but it's really, really inconvenient and very frightening, very bad for morale.
We'll go to one just over at the front there.
Thank you, firstly, for the lectures. I was wondering if you could tell us how and when treatment of PTSD or neurosis, whatever, went away from Faradism and towards medication or psychological therapies like what we have today.
It's a long process, and it continued even after the war. During the war itself, there was little psychological treatment in the Freudian sense. That came mostly... there was a little of it in Austria. Freud had two of his sons who were drafted and were fighting on different fronts, so he was also involved. But the bulk of the treatment during the early years of World War I were determining whether it's malingering, whether it's a neurological disorder, or whether it's something more or less unconscious in between. If it was something in between, like hysteria, the method of choice at the time would be to persuade the patient, to convince him that he would be cured very fast. And so there was no analysis of a deeply rooted psychological conflicts or unconscious conflicts like what psychoanalysis would understand. After a consequence of World War I was that after the war, there was, at least in France, there was a movement early in the 20s toward deinstitutionalization, so a closing psychiatric hospitals. There were psychiatric hospitals which were called asylums, and all psychiatric diseases were treated there. And there was a movement toward having dispensaries or day clinics, and so the institutionalization was a consequence of that. You understood me. And also there was a legacy of war neurosis or traumatic neurosis was PTSD. PTSD, as it is understood today, is the theory is that extreme fright will have an impact on your brain and will create anxious symptoms. But as PTSD is understood today, it's psychological, but also it's debated, but it's also wired. It's also in your brain. It's also in the fabric of your brain. It's supposed that extreme fright will change, will create an extreme conditioning that's hard to reverse. But this conditioning is translated in the brain structures that are responsible for fright, or like a nucleus accumbens or other structures. So PTSD, as it is understood today, is recognizes that extreme trauma can produce specific illness. It doesn't produce only malingering, or it doesn't produce hysteria, but it produces specific illness. But it's still debated if this illness is how psychological is it or how neurological is it. So that's still debated.
Another treatment is cathartic treatment, to do the reliving of the trauma under hypnosis or under narcose by ether. During World War I, psychiatrists have remarked that wounded somatic who were narcosed by surgical for the treatment of their wound, when at the end of narcose have a big reaction with tears, and after have no anxiety. Due to the idea of even only the psychic wounded would be under narcose with ether, chloroform, or chlorothiethyl. And in World War II, Sargent et Slater, British psychiatrists, do the same after Dunkirk and during the Blitz. Is reliving of the treatment under narcose. And when I began my study of medicine, it was 8 years after the end of World War II. I was a student and I pushed Pentotal to the soldiers. I come back from Indochine with their neurose. And after, during Algeria War, we put Pentotal and Maxiton, amphetamine, in the same injection. It is very important to have the reliving, and Freud himself has preconized the cathartic method, as in the theater of antique theater Greek, and the end of the 5 act, the catharsis is relieving, lightened. You see, it is very important, this method, cathartic, and for reliving. And also, now there is, by hypnosis is continued, and during World War II, there was, in Okinawa, there is doctors as Kaufman and Beaton use Pentotal and cathartic method. What I say also, when I was young psychiatrist, military, in military hospital of Bordeaux, in the 60s and 70s, there was veterans of World War I. We came to see the surgical to take off the shell piece that move in the leg. And in the night, in the rooms, they have nightmare and they cry. And the surgical sent me directly in consultation. And the veteran was furious. He said, I do not want to consult the doctor of the crazy. I want to, it is normal that I have nightmare because I have battle in Verdun. Donc it is normal, I am normal, I am not crazy, you see? And many people have the secret neurosis without consulting until the end of the life. And when they take their retreat, the children are away, there are no work, and all the remembrance come back, and there are activation of their neurons. Neurons never end, you see, all the life that continues. And there is, 15 years ago, I have in a congress in Stirling, the theme is post-trauma in late life, you see. It is very important, I think that. I remember my experience of Bordeaux, it is the reticence of ancient veterans to that. When the World War I was over, 11 November of 18, you see, the memory of death was honored. The wounded physical was honored. But psychical wounded were shame. They are shut. C'est nothing. And the people inflict to them the second trauma, that is the forgotten or the indifference. And all their life, they live with the silence and with the shame.
And was there something you wanted to add?
Excuse my English is not very fluent. I think that I speak English, but people that heard me are not sure of that.
I think we got there. Yeah.
We got there, yeah.
No, I was going to say that we're talking about the diagnosis of PTSD. It remains something of a contested diagnosis, and it's becoming more complicated as scanning technology improves. And we're starting to understand now that some of the cases of PTSD that have been diagnosed are, in fact, very long-term effects of head injury. head injury that it has been assumed has been cured. But in fact, that the long-term effects, the brain in recovery, may do things which look like PTSD and for which a talking cure or psychiatric therapies don't work. And this is particularly becoming a problem in Afghanistan, where we are seeing head injuries that relate to blast injury, because the effects of blast on the human brain, we're really only scratching the surface in understanding that. So PTSD and those effects, which Louis is absolutely right, this is a lifetime's worth of recovery. Again, we are looking at another cohort of patients that will suffer until the day they die, and where we are not quite where we should be in dealing with their injuries.
We have one just next to you there. Probably time for a couple more after that.
Thank you. I was very glad to hear Sargent's name mentioned because I think he was, as I think you did, very important in arguing that given the appropriate amount of stress, anybody could be subject to war neurosis. And he used in his book the reference to Pavlov, who'd shown that with opposed conditioning tasks, animals would break down. And so he was saying that this was a physiological effect. Men were confronted with something that they couldn't cope with, couldn't control, and in that situation, you could expect the behavior that you got. And I think to a large extent that argument has been accepted and carried forward into the diagnosis and so on, although interested to hear from you about the subcategory. My question was going to be about whether people were, at the time, thinking as to whether some men's dispositions made them more susceptible to this, or whether it was regarded as a universally stressful stress.
There's literature on PTSD that says that if the stressor is strong enough, hard enough, no one is immune. But if the stressor is average, IQ will protect you, and more social integration will protect you, and more if you have more responsibility, will be protected. For instance, when the USS Cole was the US battleship was attacked by terrorists off the coast of Yemen about 10 years ago. No, the US military made a study of PTSD among the crew of this battleship, and they showed that if you are close to the impact, you had more PTSD because the stressor was stronger, or if someone was killed next to you, you had more PTSD. But you are protected if you are at a middle distance from the impact. You are protected if you are an officer. Officers had less PTSD than soldiers, maybe because there are more motivation or more training in officers. If you had a higher IQ, you are protected. Maybe you had more resilience, some more cognitive strategies more possibilities for cognitive therapy or whatever. So the USS Cole is just an example, but this was replicated in many studies on PTSD.
I'd like to ask a little something about stretcher bearers. From your talk, they would seem to have been absolutely vital, and yet we never hear about them.
It's mainly because they did not come from a class which really wrote diaries and letters. And the concept of the medical auxiliary is quite hard to grasp. There was concerns in the medical profession in 1919 and 1920 that they were being forgotten about, and indeed they were. We had a couple of books that were written by them, one or two letters that went into the Imperial War Museum. They weren't poets, they weren't artists. They were working class people generally who had an idea that they wanted a training who came back from the war and became hospital porters, hospital orderlies. And the wonderful, wonderful Imperial War Museum went into geriatric homes in the 1970s and recorded interviews with stretcher bearers. And nobody looked at them until I did. Nobody listened, or not listened to them. But that's really what it is. It's a very difficult innovation to get to grips with because it doesn't have a piece of kit, doesn't have a machine, it doesn't have a poem or a picture that goes with it. It's just a process change, a logistical change. And so I decided to get in as much human detail as possible so that hopefully people will latch on to what they did and what that means. Because you take a stretcher bearer from the Somme and a combat medical technician in a Chinook helicopter in Helmand province, and this one is the ancestor of that one. You don't have that, you don't have that. It's a remarkable achievement.
A comment first. In my experience of schizophrenia, it's also the fragile ones that are more likely to, that you do have a disposition, whether you get it or not. It's an emotionally induced condition. Just on the stretcher bearers, how are you getting on with getting some publicity for them in the anniversary?
Well, I go wherever I'm asked and I talk about them. And I have a book out which has a chapter on stretcher bearers. And pretty much every fortnight I open up my email and it says, I got your book for Christmas, or I got your book. I'm sorry for people who got my book for Christmas. It's not a particularly cheap one. I always think, golly, someone said, oh, this is a book of death and suffering. I must buy it for... my friend Roy Hurst, for instance, whose father was a stretcher bearer and who never talked about it. This is the thing people come and say to me. My father, my grandfather, my uncle was a stretcher bearer and never talked about it. But he read my book and he sent me in detail that enabled me to connect. So he read the book where I talk about how stretcher bearers, you could always tell a bearer by his hands because stretcher bearer handles are wooden and they splinter, they have to wrap wire around them and it tears their hands to pieces. And he told me how his father had trouble with his hands all his life. And he said he wouldn't tell him why, and he read the chapter on stretcher bearers and he understood. So we've got a lot, we've got 4 years, we've got a long way to go, but I'm just going to go and bang on about it until somebody shuts me up. So that's wherever I go, wherever I write. I just did, Tony Robinson has a fantastic 3D series out for Sky, and they let me put a bit of stretcher bearers in that. So anyone that will listen, if you ever see me, I'll just be banging on about stretcher bearers.
We do have one over there, lady with the glasses on.
I wanted to mention something you said about the gas. 3 to 5%, not very effective on the battlefield, but there was a legacy of people who came home. My great-grandfather was one of them and died most tragically, but not recognised as being gassed in the history books. It had long-standing effects.
It does have long-standing effects, but the cohort of patients that has it is really small. It's 41,000 amputees on pensions in 1925, and the gas casualties, most of whom were recognised, mainly because of they had respiratory problems. We're probably looking at a cohort of about 3,000 or 4,000, and there is no question, it ruins their lives. There's absolutely no question. It's immensely serious, but it's a relatively small number compared to the amputees, but absolutely, and they had this noise when they breathed, and it was. I also think it was again extremely frightening, but it's serious, but it was relatively small. That sounds cold-blooded, but
I was wondering also, though, in terms of the legacy, how many people came home from the war and developed PTSD, as we now call it, gradually after time, because I know that people come home from the Iraq War and sometimes it took them time to develop it. And there's one, and the other part that I was just wondering how the stretcher bearers dealt with, did they get PTSD as well? And how did, you talked about them being strong and managing, but if no one is immune, what instances, how are they involved?
we don't have figures for that in Britain for the First World War. I don't know if you do in France.
What is complicated with the PTSD is it's a continuum from symptoms that can... PTSD is largely defined by the re-experiencing of a combat, for instance, like nightmares. But to a certain extent, all veterans will have that kind of re-experiencing. But and so then you have to define a threshold. When is it a disorder? When is it not a disorder? And it becomes very artificial. Usually, DSM, for instance, the American classification, we say that it's a disorder if it has an impact on your professional life or private life or a school, how you function at school or in life. But to a certain extent, the re-experiencing symptoms are met in everyone. Normally, it's a normal spectrum. If you have been mugged once or if you've been attacked once in a garage after parking your car, you will always be suspicious of being alone at night in a dark garage. So it's normal, but it's also a symptom of PTSD. So if you're, so it's a question of definition, and this diagnostic threshold has evolved with all successive editions of DSM 3, 4, 5, and so it's important to. In the definition, it's important to say that PTSD is caused, necessarily there must be a trauma, and this trauma must be a direct confrontation with death. It's not just watching the Twin Towers on TV. So it's not, it's a direct confrontation with death, it's not by proxy. So that's why it's difficult to say what percentages of soldiers returning from Afghanistan will suffer PTSD.
But if we project back, because we don't have any figures, and indeed people didn't 20 years after go and say I'm having my nightmares.
This New York psychoanalyst Cardinal was many decades after the war was seeing a patient. He was a 6'6" guy working as a butcher, and he said that he could carry huge pieces of beef, of meat, but if a heavily perfumed woman entered his shop, he would lose consciousness, he would faint. He would be afraid, he would be scared and faint.
Et sous hypnose, Cardinal a découvert qu'il avait été gazé à Ypres.
So a cardinal, this psychoanalyst, practiced hypnosis on him. So hypnosis to produce so that memories can resurface again. And under hypnosis, he discovered that this guy had been gassed during World War I at Ypres in Flanders.
Et que l'odeur du sang lui faisait rien, mais l'odeur du parfum des femmes lui rappelait l'odeur du gaz.
So the smell of blood in his work as a butcher didn't scare him, but a lady with perfume that would remind him of gas in Flanders.
But assume there were a lot of them. Assume if we project back, people must have had evolving problems with living with their response to the war. But of course, in Britain and France, we have something in common, and that is that in 1940 we went to war again, and all of that is lost. What we're going to see now with patients suffering from PTSD is that there isn't this immense national interruption again, that we will see this being played out, I hope. My Ukrainian isn't what it should be, but we'll just see this played out in a much more normal environment. But yeah, assume it was hundreds of thousands of people, absolutely.
Do you have any more questions? There's one just at the front here, and then maybe one or two more.
I was impressed how many well-known names were involved in these topics, from the psychiatry side. And I was wondering, in your opinion, do you think that the First World War was influencing the psychiatry and psychotherapy as we know it today? And if yes, how much?
Yeah, it probably had a long-lasting influence. Psychiatry, as we know it, started developing around 1880. So during 1880 and 1910, most of the development of psychiatry took place in Germany. Kraepelin, Freud. And at the time of World War I, in most schools of psychiatry, there was no diagnostic system and very few efficient treatment. After the war, there was maybe because of maybe because of the war, there was probably a need to have a more efficient system of diagnosis, of evaluating the impact of treatment, whether a treatment is efficient or not, of having systems of providing care that is not only asylum-based, providing care also on a large scale. So it's difficult to give a short answer to your interesting question, because it's not just one event, not one example of...
You see, that not appears in PTSD. That is the two levels in the pathology. Levels of the symptoms, nightmares and reviviscence. And under the level of the symptoms, for me, there is the impact of the trauma on the personality. And Chaim Chatan, when he described the post-Vietnam syndrome, he said there is symptoms, but the personality is transfigured. Veterans cannot contact their family. They think there are an invisible membrane in it that separates from them. And in 1918, Ernst Simmel said, when a man is buried by an explosion, not only his body is buried, but his soul is buried, his personality is buried. And he said there is a change of soul. You see? And I think that in the DSM-5, there is a beginning of change to recognize the level of the transformation, alteration of the personality, the impact of the trauma of the person.
I think we've got time for about one more question, if there's any more. There's one just there.
Hi. This is a question that picks up on another talk I went to about World War I at the IWM a few weeks ago. And there was talk about how after the war there was a kind of a rise in psychiatric care for children who were impacted on, who kind of felt the impact of their father's war experience. And I suppose I have two questions. One is, that would be interesting to hear a little bit more about, especially in this kind of idea of people's personalities being so deeply impacted by the experience of war. And also, I kind of wondered if part of that rise was because it was easier to treat children than it was to treat grown men. So, because, you know, it's harder to kind of look a grown man in the eye and treat them, because there was that shame and people didn't talk about it. So if you have any thoughts about that.
Ça a été décrit, on peut lui dire, the men, traumatized men do not speak of their trauma to their son, but they speak of their trauma to their little son. My father was wounded in Verdun. He never spoke of that to me or my brothers. And I discovered he spoke with my son. And I said, but I interest that. And I asked him to write his history. He died he was 90, you see. He had time to write. But it's interesting. And also, there was described after the Holocaust, the first generation, les rescapés de l'Holocauste n'ont pas parlé à leurs enfants, mais à leurs petits-enfants.
And this transgenerational trauma was also described for the Holocaust.
Et aussi les Arméniens.
And also with the Armenians genocide, that one generation didn't have the information, the generation after, a grandson had the information. I had a few memories of my grandfather, so my father's fathers, and I remember that we played chess together. And when we played chess, he was a French general, so he was a Joffre or Pétain. And I was a German general. I was Falkenhayn. So
There is another field. I think that there's potentially a very interesting PhD looking at the development of pediatric psychiatry in this period, because there is another significant issue for a very large number of children, and that is the great flu outbreak of 1919, which put more small children into orphanage or the care of great aunts and great uncles than the war did. And again, that's an area where we haven't looked at what is happening institutionally to paediatrics and to pediatric psychiatry. But I think it's a very interesting topic.
I think on that note, that's probably all the time that we've got for questions. And so just really to say thank you very much to Louis Crocq and Marc-Antoine and to Emily Mayhew. Thank you very much.